This is Peter Brown from Bio 108. We're going to talk about plant medicine. So plant medicine are plants that treat disease, and we're also going to talk a lot about plants that are psychoactive or alter mood. These are some of the most popular plants, and here's one that alters mood. It's marijuana, and so people use it to relax and chill out, as well as medicinal uses. So herbal medicine versus going to the pharmacy and buying prescription drugs or over-the-counter drugs. So herbal medicine is taking a plant and using parts of the plant directly. The leaves, stems, root, flowers, and that's what's been used for thousands of years. And if you were treated a few hundred years ago with herbal medicine, you were lucky, because the other kind of things they did was ward off evil spirit or bleed you or do things that might really do you harm. And so a lot of modern medicine has its roots in herbal medicine. So modern prescription drugs trace their history back a couple hundred years. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of modern medicine. But most of the time when you go into the pharmacy, you're buying something where they know and measure the active ingredient, whether it comes from a plant or a fungus or a synthetic. And then they take these pre-measured doses and put it into a liquid or a pill so you know exactly how much of the active ingredient you're getting. Okay, and even today, at a time when we think, okay, oh, I don't use herbal medicine, if you're buying prescription drugs, a lot of prescriptions written have drugs that come from plants or from fungi. And I don't know if this is true or not, but I read about a quarter of prescriptions written have plant-derived ingredients and about a quarter have fungi-derived ingredients. In any case, there are a lot of prescriptions that have active ingredients that still come from plants. So for example, morphine. Morphines are most widely used pain reliever, and India is the biggest legal grower, and so we'll talk a little bit about opium poppies. Okay. Fungi, things like penicillin, comes from a mold, which is a fungus. And so there's still a lot of drugs that come from fungi. And then there are a lot of synthetic drugs that people learned about because of plants, but now they make it less expensively using a synthetic process. So for example, we'll talk about aspirin. And originally aspirin came from willow bark. Now nobody's growing willow bark to harvest aspirin, or at least not in large quantities. Instead, it's made from petroleum. When they pump oil out of the ground, one of the byproducts of oil can be used as a starting point for chemists to make aspirin. Here's a coin from a city of Cyrene in North Africa that no longer exists, and it shows the silphium plant, which we know from writing was used for birth control, and the plant was so popular that it was picked to extinction. So early writings on plant medicine are found around the world. There are clay tablets in the Middle East, in what today is Iraq, and what's called Sumer. In Egypt, the Ebers papyrus contained hundreds of remedies, including garlic to help with the circulation. In China, there were writings called the Pansao. In India, the Rig Veda is a collection of sacred verses called Ayurvedic medicine. Because we didn't understand early Aztec writing so well, what we know mostly about their medicine comes from when the Spaniards came in the 1500s and wrote down what they told them. But there are systems of herbal medicine, many that have obviously been lost, but from all over the world. The early Greeks believed that diseases had natural causes and used herbal remedies to cause these. So that was different than a lot of people. A lot of people thought if you had problems, maybe you were a bad person or there were evil spirits in you. And so willow bark is one of the things used by the Greeks. And in the 1400s, the printing press was invented. So the 1500s and 1600s called the Age of Herbals, and besides printing religious texts, they printed what was most important. So they printed all these herbal recipes and what the plants looked like. And so there was an overlap between people who were physicians and people who were plant scientist, because if you were a good physician, you knew your plants. So this is from a Native American museum in Connecticut, paying honors to Native American healers. Some of the plants that Native American used were echinacea, which today people use it. They say if you have a cold, you take it and it stimulates your immune system. A bloodroot, which people use as an emetic if you need to throw something up because you ate poison or something, you can do bloodroot. And there are many more herbal medicines used by Native people. Some they've kept themselves. They don't want white people going in their land and stealing all their medicines. This is from Mexico City. It shows an herbaria, an herbal medicine store. And so don't think that herbal medicine is something once we did and we don't do anymore. So especially in rural parts of the world, especially in poorer parts of the world, sometimes over half the people use herbal medicine. And even in cities, they might not be able to go out in the woods and find those herbal medicines, but they're more familiar with them. And so here's a store that sells herbal medicines in one of the biggest cities in the world. The Amazon rainforest is a great place to find herbal medicine. So here's a tribe from Venezuela, and your Canvas quiz this week is from a talk by a scientist who spent a lot of time in the Amazon rainforest, and he'll tell you about some of the things going on there. So there are hundreds of plant medicines used, but I picked 6 of the most widely used to talk about. And some of the most widely used are psychoactive. They alter our mood. So 4 of these are definitely psychoactive: marijuana, tobacco, tea, coffee, although they also have medical uses. Opium poppy is used for pain. So is that psychoactive? I don't know. If you were having surgery, you'd say, I just wanted to kill pain. And then willow bark is one of the earliest uses of medicine. So we'll talk about these 6. And then in lab, we'll explore more. So marijuana has a bad rap because it's a Schedule I drug. In other words, the federal government says there are no medical uses and it's highly addictive. But both those things are probably not true. And so it was first domesticated 12,000 years ago in China. And so here's a really interesting study if you want to look at it. And they based its age based on DNA studies. And the other thing they said in this study, about 4,000 years ago, they separated into strains that were better for psychoactive effects and strains that were better for fibers. So it's used for fibers and paper and cloth and that kind of thing as well. This is from Alice in Wonderland, and the blue caterpillar is sitting there on a hookah smoking. So don't think that the use of psychoactive drugs is something that happened in the 1960s with Woodstock. The history of people altering their moods goes back thousands and thousands of years. So whether or not marijuana is a medicine, it's been used as a medicine historically, but because of its prohibition in the United States, it's been very hard for scientists to study it. So it's understudied as far as its medical uses, although people propose it has a lot of different uses. But the 4 uses that it's used for most often is people who are going through chemotherapy, so it's very good to help as an appetite stimulant and with nausea. Pain relief, so with the opioid crisis, some people are finding pain relief from marijuana. People who have epilepsy, there are certain kinds of epilepsy that are out of control, and it's actually not the parts of marijuana that get you high, but the other parts that seem to help people with epilepsy. And of course, a lot of people just take it for relaxation, stress relief. And so while we're focusing on the benefits, like any mind-altering drug, you don't want to drive a car with marijuana, and young people want to not smoke marijuana because it has psychological harm in that it's amotivational. When you smoke too much marijuana, you don't really want to get your work done or do anything. You just want to hang around and smoke more marijuana. So, older people can probably regulate it, but younger people should stay away. All right, nicotine. So here's some tobacco plants grown in France, and I've always wondered, I've never been a tobacco smoker, about 14% of Americans are, and I've always wondered why people don't plant tobacco. It's so expensive, but it looks like a pretty plant, and I don't think it's that hard to grow, but maybe drying it and preparing it is difficult. But tobacco has a long history, and before Columbus came to the Americas, it was unknown outside of the Americas. So the Native Americans are the ones that grew tobacco. It was used by the Incas in South America 5,000 years ago. It was farmed by the Mayans in Central America 2,500 years ago. There were some tribes like the Blackfoot and Crow that did not farm anything except growing tobacco. So it sort of had a sacred place in a lot of the Native American cultures. And when Columbus's men came to the Caribbean, they saw natives drinking smoke, and they didn't quite know what it was all about. And then sailors brought the tobacco with seeds back to Europe, and as they went around the world, they spread it around the world. And so it became one of the drugs to spread the most rapidly around the world. It became an important source of revenue for the colonies in the Americas. And here's a painting, what it might have looked like when they were growing tobacco in the farms of Virginia. So tobacco has a lot of different compounds, but the compound that people often focus on is nicotine. And nicotine makes you relax and causes a lot of physiological effects. It's a very addictive compound, so once you start, it's hard to stop. Okay, so here's a 4-minute video clip showing how nicotine affects the brain. So the psychoactive molecules trigger effects in the brain, and it's showing how it binds to receptors in the brain which trigger an effect. Both green tea or black tea have potential health benefits, and you click on these articles, and a lot of these are just correlations. So once you get sick, they're not going to help you. But if people who drink green tea or people who drink black tea seem to have lower rates of certain cancer, it seems to be an antioxidant. It prevents some of the damaging effects of breathing oxygen. Anti-obesity, antimicrobial, protects against heart attacks, protects against brain aging. So a lot of these are correlational studies, but there are very few harms of drinking tea. So if you like to drink tea, I would say just go for it. A lot of times when people think about tea, they think about the caffeine in it, and it does have caffeine. And so the harms are often associated with too much caffeine. So if you're having problems sleeping or anxiety or stomach upset, then you may be drinking too many cups a day or too much closer to bedtime. When I was younger, I could drink coffee like crazy, and now I try to limit myself. All right, so here's kind of a fun look at tea in the American Revolution. So this is a famous lithograph by Ives and Currier, and it shows that the British imposed a tea tax on the colonists in the Americas, and the colonists dressed up as Native American Indians, and then they threw the tea overboard into Boston Harbor to protest against the taxes, no taxation without representation. And so it became a patriotic thing in the Americas to switch from tea and instead drink. All right, so that's a good transition to talking about coffee. So here's a coffee tree, and here are the fruits on the coffee tree. And you can see when the fruits are ripe, they turn red. And again, it's a crop that you wouldn't grow in the United States, that you grow on the equator. And here is a fruit, and you can see inside the fruit are two seeds, and those seeds are the coffee beans. The coffee beans are separated from the pulp, and then they're roasted and then ground and made into coffee. There's some question of where coffee originated, but a lot of people tell the story about Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa, and that a goat herder was out tending his flock, and he saw the goats eating coffee beans and dancing. So I put a little dancing goat here. I once had a very nice young man from Ethiopia who took my class a few years ago. So I said to him, where do you buy your coffee? Because I thought, oh, he's going to steer me to the best coffee in town. And he kind of smiled and he said, I buy my beans green at an Arab market, a market in downtown Tempe, and then I roast them on a frying pan as I need them. So I bought green beans and tried it, but it was a lot of work. I didn't do much of a very good job. But, you know, so Ethiopia was the original home of coffee, people say, and then it went from there to the Middle East, and the Arab countries drink a lot of coffee, and then from there it went to Europe and eventually the United States. So it only goes back about 700 years. It's not as old as some other products. Okay, so that just kind of tells you the spread of coffee. And then today, of course, coffee farming is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's the third leading beverage people drink. Water's 1, tea is 2, coffee is number 3. 100 million people work in coffee farming. Okay, that doesn't count all the Starbucks and coffee shops around the world. There are 2 species that dominate. The better coffee is Arabica. So when you go to Starbucks, they're serving Arabica. But there's a cheaper kind called Robusta, and it's grown because it's more disease resistant. And here's just a nice little video. I don't think I asked you about it, but it's a 2-minute video showing how people pick coffee and how they separate the pulp from the seeds, if you want to look at it. So this is civet coffee. These animals are called civets, and they feed them the cherries of coffee, and they pick the beans out of their poop, and then they roast them, and they say when the beans pass through the digestive system, they partly process it and mellow the coffee. And so it's the most expensive coffee in the world, and it's made in Indonesia. If I was in Asia, if I was in Bali, I might try it, but I don't think I would buy it on the internet. All right, so like tea, we think of caffeine when we think of coffee, but it contains lots of other compounds. And like tea, they do these correlation studies and say how much coffee do you drink, and they look at what people have rates of, and they think coffee may help type 2 diabetes, stroke, depression, things like Parkinson's. Okay, and some evidence suggests this is true for decaf coffee as well. So that says it's not the caffeine, it's the other compounds. And here's a nice article kind of explaining this and showing some of the charts they draw. And like tea, the potential harms from drinking too much coffee are really the caffeinated harms, too much anxiety, stomach upset, being nervous, having problems sleeping. All right, why do plants produce these compounds that have mammalian effects? Because a lot of what plants are doing is they have a love-hate relationship with animals. They want to use animals to pollinate them, but they don't want animals to eat them up. And so, especially insects, a lot of these compounds are anti-insect compounds. So something that's a stimulant for us might cause convulsions in insects. So things like nicotine, caffeine, they're all against insects. Okay. Okay. So how do you get from using plants to modern drugs? Sometimes William Withering is said to be the father of modern drugs. He was a physician and a botanist who lived in the 1700s. And there was somebody who was being treated with an herbal remedy of 20 different herbs. And he went through scientifically and said, let's try this one, let's try this one. And he figured out what was helping this person was the purple foxglove. They suffered from what they call dropsy, which is really congestive heart failure. When you get older, your heart doesn't pump hard enough, and so all your liquid kind of pools towards your lower legs, and so it's called dropsy. And he figured out, hey, it's the foxglove that's really making the heart contract more strongly. And later on, they figured out it was the drug digitalis. And so until 5 or 10 years ago, digitalis was still used as a treatment for heart disease. Since then, it's been replaced by beta blockers, but it was used for many years. And people still grow purple foxglove, and it's grown because it has these beautiful purple flowers. And here's some growing in a forest in West Germany. So that was the late 1700s, and then German chemists were the first ones to isolate an active ingredient from a plant. And it was morphine, which comes from the opium poppy. So that was in the early 1800s, and opium has a long history. On some tablets from Sumer, it was called the joy plant 6,000 years ago. So people have known about opium and its effects for thousands of years. And we have an opioid problem in this country, but it's still the drug that people use for pain in hospitals. So if I was having surgery, that's what I would want. And so morphine and codeine are direct products from opium. Morphine is highly addictive, codeine moderately, and it's directly from the poppy. It's isolated. India is the leading grower in the world, so there are farmers that are growing it legally to be made into morphine and codeine. And for severe pain relief, morphine. So if you're going to have surgery in the hospital, for a cough suppressant, codeine, and then morphine gets converted into heroin, and that has no legal use. And now there are synthetic opioids. So fentanyl is one you hear about. A lot of people who are overdose on drugs have fentanyl in their preparations, and it's 50 times more powerful. So I'm not sure what the starting material is for fentanyl, but the compound is opioid-like. All right, here's some more history. So if doctors knew some of the history of opioids, they would know that there's no such thing as a non-addictive opioid. So in the 1800s, Britain was traveling to China because China was making tea, they were making silk, they were making porcelain, and Britain was going there with empty ships because they didn't make anything that the Chinese wanted. And so they figured out, well, we'll bring opium to China because India was a British colony, and they got a bunch of Chinese addicted to opium. Well, the Chinese government wasn't very happy, and so they boarded one of their ships and they threw the opium into the harbor. Well, the British ships were the strongest ships in the world. They came back and attacked the Chinese, and the Chinese signed a treaty in the 1840s, and they said Hong Kong will be a place you can trade, you can bring opium or whatever you want. And until 1997, one of the interesting things about mainland China is Hong Kong was a British colony. All right, during the Civil War, a lot of soldiers were addicted to morphine, and so they came out with a solution. They said, instead of making morphine, we'll make heroin. And so this is a label from the early 1900s, and it says, well, the heroin is good for coughs, bronchitis, laryngitis, pneumonia, asthma. And here's the adult dose. Here's for children of 10 or older. Here's for children of 3 or older. And it probably wasn't a very good idea. And by 14 years later, the U.S. government passed the Harrison Narcotics Act. And they said, hey, opioids are addictive and it's okay for serious conditions, but it shouldn't be in cough syrup. And so today we have an opioid crisis. Too many people are abusing them. 50,000 people died from opioids a few years ago. You can click on this link and we'll give you the U.S. government, National Institutes of Health data. And they say it costs the economy about $78 billion a year. Healthcare, lost productivity, addiction treatment, criminal justice involvement. And the cause was that in the late 1990s, a drug company called Purdue Pharmaceuticals they developed a slow-release opioid called OxyContin. And with no evidence, the salespeople were going around saying that it was not addictive. And so they wrote thousands and thousands of prescriptions. Once you get addicted to opioids, it's very hard to quit. So the doctors should have known better. The salespeople should have known better. Opioids have a long history. If you take this class, you can read some of the history of it. And opioids have always been addictive. If you're interested in that, the Maricopa Community Colleges offer courses on substance abuse. It's a very difficult subject. I have a brother who's a doctor who works for the Veterans Administration for the VA, and he says, when veterans come in who are addicted, most of them don't want to get off. So he says you just have to write a prescription which give them enough for their personal use, but not enough so they sell it. He said if you cut back on their prescription, they're going to buy it in the streets, and you don't want that either. So the trick with cigarette smoking or opioids is not to get addicted in the first place, right? Okay. So the first drug to be isolated by the German chemist was morphine from the opium poppy, and the second one was salicylic acid from willow bark. Willow bark has a long history, so here are leaves of the white willow, and willow bark was found independently by Europeans and by Native Americans, and it was used as an anti-inflammatory and a pain reliever. And in the late 1800s, because salicylic acid was so difficult to take, a lot of people didn't tolerate it because of the gastrointestinal effects. A German chemist, so the Germans were wonderful chemists, working for the Bayer company, you've probably heard of Bayer aspirin, he made salicylic acid into acetylsalicylic acid, which still has stomach upset problems, but is not as bad as salicylic acid. And so aspirin is still one of the most widely used drugs in the world. So here's the Eber's papyrus. I can't read that, but one of the herbal remedies it mentioned, and this was over 3,000 years ago, was salix, or the willow tree. So even today, it's one of the most inexpensive and widely used medications. It's an anti-inflammatory, it's a fever reducer. They tell older people to take it before they travel on a plane because it inhibits blood clotting so you don't get a clot. And it was a drug that probably wouldn't be approved if we found out about it in later years, because until 1970, we didn't know what its mechanism of action was. But now we know that it inhibits certain enzymes and certain pathways that make prostaglandins. And prostaglandins are part of an inflammatory response. Sometimes, like if you get a splinter in your finger or something, you want to stimulate inflammation because it pulls some of the immune cells to that area. But sometimes the inflammation is too much. We have a lot of autoimmune diseases. And so by inhibiting prostaglandins, it inhibits inflammation. Aspirin kind of went out of favor in the 1960s because it has a serious but very rare side effect called Rey syndrome for people under 18. So a lot of people have kind of replaced it with Tylenol, which is good for pain, acetaminophen, and ibuprofen, which is good for inflammation. So again, plants are producing these drugs not to go from seed to seed. These drugs don't really have any effects directly on plants, but to protect themselves from insects. So if somebody attacked you, you'd probably run away. But plants can't do that. They're sessile. They stay in place their whole life. So they've become great chemists. They make a lot of things that we can't make. Okay, so they're trying to attract insects for pollination. They're trying to attract animals to eat their fruit and spread their seeds, but they don't want animals to bite on their leaves and chew them up. So a lot of these compounds aren't released until insects or herbivores chew on their leaves. And what is poison to insects often has medicinal or psychoactive effects for us. So we smoke nicotine and feel relaxed, but insects eat nicotine and die. A lot of plant compounds are alkaloids. Alkaloids have a bitter taste because they're basic in terms of pH. So that's why Mary Poppins sang a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Chemists have decided to add an ion E suffix on the end of alkaloids. They have ring structures with a nitrogen group on them. So examples of alkaloids are nicotine, morphine, caffeine. So these are all things that are alkaloid compounds. And some of the plant families with alkaloids are the sunflower family, the nightshade family, the poppy family, the coffee family. So just like you say, well, cactuses tend to have spines because their ancestors had spines. The same is true for a lot of these plant families. Somewhere early on, the plant surviving had an alkaloid and it passed on those alkaloids to the offspring. And so alkaloids tend to run in certain plant families. In lab, we'll do some infusions and we'll do a research on some plant herbals. A lot of the herbals we'll probably look at in lab are things we either have on campus or in the campus gardens or in the grocery store. Things like ginger, basil, eucalyptus, things that you can buy in the grocery store. So don't think that herbals, that you need to buy them in a pill all prepared. You can buy the plant and do a preparation yourself. So we'll go ahead and try that and do some research. So herbals are regulated by the FDAs, unlike prescription drugs, which have to show they're effective to cure certain diseases. Herbals are not allowed to claim that they cure diseases in particular. They're just allowed to make general claims like increases your energy and that kind of thing. So what I would say about herbals is caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. It's up to you to think about what you're putting in the body and what you're buying and whether you really want to do that.